If you look at the history books, you'll see John Adams standing alone in portraits. But if you could look inside his mind, you would see a constant, feverish dialogue with a woman named Abigail Smith Adams. In the 1700s, women were legally invisible once they married. They couldn't vote, own property, or hold office. But Abigail Adams was arguably the most powerful woman in the American Revolution, and she did it all from a drafty farmhouse in Braintree, Massachusetts, and through the ink of her pen. John and Abigail's relationship was a meeting of the minds. While John was away for years at a time, first in Philadelphia and then in Europe, they wrote over 1,100 letters to each other. These weren't just love letters. They were intelligence briefings. Abigail was John's eyes and ears on the ground. She managed the family farm, fended off creditors, raised their children, and reported on the political mood of New England. In March 1776, as John was debating independence in Philadelphia, Abigail sent him one of the most famous letters in American history. She didn't just ask him to be a good leader. She challenged the very core of his philosophy. She wrote, "In the new code of laws, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." John, being the stubborn New Englander he was, playfully brushed it off. But he never forgot it. He knew that without Abigail's strength at home, he couldn't be a hero abroad. She was his dearest friend, his only true confidant, and the person who kept his massive ego in check. In 1778, the revolution was in trouble. America needed money, weapons, and recognition from Europe. The Continental Congress sent John Adams to France to join Benjamin Franklin. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Benjamin Franklin was a celebrity. He wore fur hats, flirted with French noblewomen, and stayed out late at parties. He was the cool diplomat. John Adams was the opposite. He didn't speak French well, he hated the decadence of Paris, and he thought Franklin was lazy and immoral. Adams could understand why Franklin spent so much time charming the French instead of demanding their help. The French ministers grew to hate Adams, calling him irascible and clumsy. Realizing he was being sidelined in Paris, he did something incredibly bold and incredibly risky. He left France without permission and headed to the Netherlands. Imagine Adams arriving in Amsterdam in 1780. He was sick with nervous fever, he was alone, and the Dutch were terrified of offending the British. For months, the Dutch government refused to even see him. Adams was a man on an island, but this is where his stubbornness became America's greatest asset. He didn't give up. He began a one-man PR campaign. He wrote articles for Dutch newspapers, explained the American cause to wealthy bankers, and argued that a free America would be a goldmine for Dutch trade. In 1782, his persistence paid off. The Netherlands officially recognized the United States and granted a $2 million loan, a massive sum at the time. This money didn't just buy muskets, it saved the American economy from total collapse. Adams called this the greatest victory of my life. He had beaten the British not with a sword, but with a ledger. Eventually, the war ended, and the Treaty of Paris, 1783, was signed. John was then given the most awkward job in the world. He was named the first American minister to Great Britain. Imagine the tension. Adams had to walk into St. James's Palace and stand face to face with King George III, the man he had spent 20 years trying to overthrow. The meeting was surprisingly respectful. The king told Adams, "I was the last to consent to the separation. But the separation having been made, I will be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power." By this time, Abigail had finally joined him in Europe. Together, they navigated the snobbish courts of London and Paris. They were the first family of American diplomacy, representing a ragtag group of colonies that had just embarrassed the greatest empire on earth. But this service came at a heavy price. John missed years of his children's lives. He was often lonely, depressed, and convinced that the American people would never appreciate what he had done. He saw Franklin and Jefferson getting all the glory while he did the heavy lifting in the cold rooms of Amsterdam and London. This recognition hunger would haunt him for the rest of his life. It made him defensive and sensitive to criticism. When he finally returned to America in 1788, he was a hero to some, but a stranger to many. The stage was set for the next chapter. the vice presidency, a role he would famously describe as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Adams was back, and he was ready to lead, but he was about to realize that fighting a king was easy compared to fighting his own fellow Americans. The air in Boston, on the night of March 5th, 1770, didn't smell like freedom. It smelled of salt, horse manure, and impending death. Imagine the scene. Ice and snow coat the cobblestones of King Street, lone British sentries being harassed by a mob of angry colonists. They aren't just shouting, they are hurling ice-covered rocks, oyster shells, and clubs. They are daring the redcoat to fire. Then, in the chaos, a shot rings out. Then another. When the smoke clears, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. This was the Boston Massacre. Within hours, the city was a powder keg. The people of Boston wanted blood. They wanted the soldiers hanged. Every lawyer in town refused to touch the case, knowing that defending the British would be social and professional suicide. But one man, a 34-year-old farmer-turned-lawyer named John Adams, took the case. Why? Because John Adams believed in a concept that was more important to him than his own popularity: the rule of law. The lawyer versus the mob. John Adams was not a man of the elite. He was a short, stout man from Braintree who grew up with dirt under his fingernails. He was prickly, prone to vanity, and deeply self-critical. But he had a backbone made of New England granite. When he took the defense of Captain Thomas Preston and his 8 soldiers, his own cousin, the fiery revolutionary Samuel Adams, was horrified. His neighbors hissed at him in the streets. In that cramped, candlelit courtroom, Adams faced a jury that hated the men he was defending. But Adams performed a masterclass in legal strategy. He didn't argue that the British were good men. He argued that the facts didn't care about their feelings. He famously told the court, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." He proved that the mob had provoked the soldiers to the point of Against all odds, he won an acquittal for the captain and most of the men. It was the most unpopular victory in American history, yet it proved that the American colonies were not a land of lawless mobs, but a place where even an enemy deserved a fair trial. The transformation. From lawyer to rebel. You might think defending the British would make Adams a loyalist. It did the opposite. While he believed in the law, he began to realize that the British Parliament was breaking its own laws by taxing the colonies without representation. By 1774, the stubborn lawyer had become a stubborn revolutionary. He was sent to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, while other delegates were cautious and terrified of a total break with King George III. Adams was already seeing the future. He was impatient. He stayed up late into the night, writing in his diary about the follies of those who still hoped for a peaceful reconciliation. He wasn't a charismatic speaker like Patrick Henry. He didn't have the cool factor of George Washington. Instead, he was the Atlas of independence. He worked 18-hour days, serving on over 90 committees and chairing 25 of them. He was the man responsible for the boring stuff that makes a revolution work: logistics, military supplies, and Navy organization. The master of strategy. By June 1776, the tension in Philadelphia was at a breaking point. The colonies were at war, but they hadn't yet declared their independence. Adams knew that if he, the obnoxious and unpopular New Englander, proposed the motion for independence, he'd make file. So, he played the ultimate political game. He stepped back and let Richard Henry Lee of Virginia propose the resolution. And when it came time to write the document that would change the world, Adams made perhaps the most selfless decision of his life. He was a brilliant writer, but he knew that Thomas Jefferson, a tall, quiet, and eloquent Virginian, had a mastery of the pen that could win over the hearts of the people. Adams famously argued with Jefferson, who tried to turn the job down. Adams told him, 1. You are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. 2. I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. 3. You can write 10 times better than I can. The Birth of a Nation. On July 2nd, 1776, The Continental Congress finally voted for independence. Adams was ecstatic. He wrote to his wife, Abigail, predicting that July 2nd would be celebrated by future generations with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. He was off by 2 days, as we celebrate the 4th, the day the document was formally adopted. John Adams was the engine of the American Revolution. If Washington was the sword and Jefferson was the pen, Adams was the heart. He was the one who convinced the skeptical, the fearful, and the hesitant that a world without a king was not only possible but necessary. But as the smoke of the revolution cleared, Adams would find that building a country was much harder than starting a war. He had spent his youth defending the law against a mob. He would spend his presidency defending the government against his own friends. In 1789, John Adams returned from his diplomatic triumphs in Europe, expecting to be greeted as a conquering hero. Instead, he found himself in a strange, secondary position. George Washington was the unanimous choice for president, and Adams, having received the second most votes, became the first vice president of the United States. For a man with Adams' intellect and ego, the vice presidency was a nightmare. He was a man of action, yet his only job was to sit in the Senate and cast a vote only in the event of a tie. He famously wrote to Abigail that the vice presidency was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. He spent 8 years in Washington's shadow watching as the rock star. President received all the credit while Adams sat in the Senate, frustrated by the growing divide between two men who would become his greatest rivals, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. When Washington decided to step down in 1796, the father of the country left a massive vacuum. For the first time, America had a contested election. It wasn't a gentlemanly affair. It was a street fight. On one side were the Federalists, who wanted a strong central government and a booming industrial economy. They chose Adams. On the other side were the Democratic Republicans, who wanted a nation of small farmers and more power for individual states. They chose Thomas Jefferson. The campaign was vicious. Supporters of Jefferson called Adams a monarchist who wanted to crown himself king. Supporters of Adams called Jefferson a dangerous atheist who would bring the chaos of the French Revolution to American shores. When the dust settled, Adams won by a razor-thin margin, 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68. Under the rules of the time, the runner-up became vice president. This meant John Adams was forced to lead a country while his bitter political rival and former best friend was his second. It was a recipe for disaster. March 4th, 1797, was the day of Adams' inauguration. It should have been his greatest moment, but even then, he felt like a supporting actor. As he stood to take the oath, the crowd didn't look at him. They looked at George Washington, many of them weeping because the great man was leaving. Adams later wrote to Abigail, "I am heir to an enormous weight of popularity which is not my own." He knew that every move he made would be compared to Washington. If he was too firm, he was a tyrant. If he was too soft, he was weak. He was walking a tightrope over a canyon of political fire. Adams made a fatal mistake early on. He kept Washington's cabinet. He thought this would provide stability, but he didn't realize that these men weren't loyal to him. They were loyal to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the puppet master of the Federalist Party. Even though he wasn't in the government anymore, he was secretly writing letters to Adams' cabinet members, telling them to ignore the president's orders. Adams was essentially a captain whose crew was taking orders from a different ship, while Adams wanted to keep America out of European wars. Hamilton and the High Federalists wanted to build a massive army and go to war with France. Adams was caught between a Vice President Jefferson who loved France and a cabinet that wanted to destroy France. The biggest crisis of his presidency was the Quasi-War. France, angry that America was trading with their enemy, Great Britain, began seizing American merchant ships. Over 300 ships were captured. The American public was screaming for blood. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became the rallying cry. Adams was a Navy man. He understood that America's strength wasn't in a massive standing army which he feared would lead to a military dictatorship, but in a strong fleet. He pushed through the funding for the first great frigates of the U.S. Navy, including the USS Constitution Old Ironsides. But while he built the ships, he refused to pull the trigger. He knew that a full-scale war with France would bankrupt the U.S. and likely lead to a civil war at home. He chose to negotiate a decision that made him a traitor in the eyes of his own party. In November 1800, near the end of his term, John Adams became the first president to move into the unfinished presidential mansion, now the White House, in the new capital of Washington, D.C. The house was a mess. The walls were wet, the rooms were drafty, and the surrounding city was a swamp filled with mosquitoes. On his second night there, he wrote a prayer in a letter to Abigail that is now carved into the mantel of the state dining room. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. It was a beautiful sentiment, but Adams wouldn't get to enjoy the house for long. He was exhausted, his party was in shambles, and the most controversial chapter of his life, Alien and Sedition Acts, was about to lead to his downfall. He was a man who had saved the peace, but lost his people. By 1798, the United States was vibrating with anxiety. It felt like the country was on the verge of a nervous breakdown across the Atlantic. The French Revolution had turned into a reign of terror, and many Americans feared that French spies and radical immigrants were hiding in the shadows of Philadelphia and New York, plotting to overthrow the government. John Adams, usually a man of cool legal logic, was not immune to this fear. He was being attacked daily in the press. Editors called him a blind, bold, toothless, querulous Adams, and a hideous hermaphroditical character. His own vice president, Thomas Jefferson, was secretly funding these newspapers to destroy Adams' reputation. Feeling cornered and convinced that the nation was under internal threat, Adams signed the four most controversial laws in American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts. These weren't just tough laws. They were a direct assault on the Bill of Rights. The Alien Acts gave the president the power to deport any non-citizen he deemed dangerous without a trial. The Sedition Act made it a crime to write, print, or speak anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the government or the president. Imagine the scene. Federal marshals began arresting newspaper editors. A man in New Jersey was even arrested for making a joke about the president's backside. To the Democratic Republicans, this was proof that John Adams had become the very thing he fought against in 1776, a tyrant. Adams didn't personally lead the witch hunts, but he didn't stop them either. He believed he was protecting the sacred office of the presidency from being destroyed by lies. In reality, he was destroying his own legacy. This was the moment the friendship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson officially died. Jefferson was so horrified by the Sedition Act that he fled the capital, working in secret. He and James Madison wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that states had the right to nullify federal laws they found unconstitutional. This was a dangerous moment. The United States was less than 25 years old, and already the president and vice president were essentially at war. The country was splitting into two hostile camps. Civil war seemed more likely than a peaceful election. While the domestic front was a disaster, the foreign front was an explosion. Adams sent 3 diplomats to France to negotiate peace, but 3 French agents secretly named X, Y, and Z demanded a massive bribe of $250,000 just to start talking. When Adams released the papers to the public, the country went wild. For a brief moment, Adams was a hero. People wore black cockades in their hats to show support for the president. His own party, the Federalists, begged him to declare war. They wanted to use the army to crush France abroad and crush Jefferson's party at home. But John Adams did the bravest thing of his life. He said no. He knew that the Federalists wanted war for political power, not for the country's safety. Against the advice of his cabinet and his party, he sent one last peace mission to France. He sacrificed his chance at a second term to prevent a war that would have torn America apart. His party was so angry they called him a traitor and abandoned him. The election of 1800 is often called the Revolution of 1800. It was the most toxic election in history. Adams was attacked by the Republicans for being a tyrant and by his own Federalist Party, led by Hamilton for being too weak. When the results came in, Adams had lost. He was the first one-term president. The heartbreak was compounded by personal tragedy. His son, Charles, died of alcoholism during the election, having been disowned by John for his immoral lifestyle. Adams was a man broken by politics and grief. In his final weeks in office, Adams didn't just pack his bags. He worked until the last minute. appointing Federalists to judgeships to ensure his party's principles survived. The most famous of these was John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a move that would shape American law for the next 30 years. On the morning of March 4th, 1801, John Adams did something that had almost never happened in world history. A powerful leader peacefully gave up power to his greatest enemy. He didn't stay for Jefferson's inauguration. At 4 a.m., in the cold morning mist, Adams boarded a public stagecoach and left Washington, D.C. He was bitter, he was tired, and he was convinced that history would forget him. He headed back to his farm in Massachusetts, leaving behind a White House that was still damp with plaster and a country that was still trying to figure out if it could survive without a king. He thought his story was over. In reality, the most poetic chapter of his life. The long twilight of his retirement was just beginning. When John Adams arrived back at his farm, Peacefield, in Quincy, Massachusetts, in 1801, he was a man discarded. He was 65 years old. His political career was dead, and he was convinced he would be remembered as a footnote of failed bridge between the greatness of Washington and the brilliance of Jefferson. For the next 11 years, a great silence fell between Quincy and Monticello. Adams and Jefferson, the two giants who had stood shoulder to shoulder in 1776, did not speak. They were like two old lions, licking their wounds in their respective dens.